The mansion was alive with its usual morning routine. Workers moved quickly, polishing the already shining floors and arranging the dining table as if royalty was about to arrive. The maid entered quietly, carrying her small daughter by the hand. She had been bringing her along for weeks now, because she had no one else to watch over her. The little girl was shy, always staying close to her mother, but her wide eyes could not help wandering across the grand chandeliers and tall windows. Everything looked magical to her, even though she knew she didn't belong there. That day was not an ordinary one. The CEO of the house, a man with power and wealth spread across the globe, was preparing for the most important meeting of his career. Investors were flying in, and the deal on the table was worth billions. Everyone in the house was tense, every step and sound carefully measured. The air itself seemed heavy with expectation. The maid worked faster than usual, trying not to make a single mistake. She whispered to her daughter to stay in the corner with her book and not move around. The girl nodded, clutching the book to her chest. For the CEO, timing was everything. He paced the wide hall in his dark suit, rehearsing his lines in his head. Every second mattered. He didn't notice the maid's daughter sitting quietly near the stairs, swinging her legs slowly, eyes fixed on the tall paintings that covered the walls. To her, it felt like a museum, each frame telling a story she wanted to touch. As the clock ticked closer to the meeting, the silence grew sharper. The girl, nervous from the stillness, stood up carefully with her book pressed against her chest. She wanted to shift closer to her mother, who was in the dining area dusting the chairs, but her small shoes tapped lightly on the marble floor, the sound bouncing in the empty hall. At that very moment, the CEO turned and noticed her. His eyes narrowed, his jaw tightened. He had no patience for distraction, especially today. The girl froze, unsure whether to move forward or run back to the corner. The book slipped slightly from her grip, and she bent quickly to catch it before it fell. The air seemed to pause with her small movement. The maid looked up, her heart skipping. She knew her employer's temper. She knew what a single mistake could mean. The girl lifted her eyes and saw the CEO staring straight at her. Would he stay silent or would the storm break? The sharp silence after that moment carried into the next day. Everyone in the mansion remembered how the CEO's gaze had frozen on the maid's daughter, but the true weight of his reaction was about to unfold. The morning sun spilled across the polished floors when the foreign investors finally arrived. They stepped out of their sleek cars with quiet authority, their suits tailored, their faces calm but unreadable. This was not just another meeting, it was history in the making. Billions rested on the table, and every detail mattered. The maid tried to keep her daughter tucked away, but children have a way of moving where they are not expected. The girl, curious as ever, clutched her school book and slipped closer to the meeting room. She didn't understand the value of what was happening, only that her mother looked more worried than usual. She wanted to be near her dot inside the grand hall. The CEO welcomed his guests with a sharp smile, shaking hands with a confidence that bordered on arrogance. He believed his numbers, his empire, and his charm would be enough. His voice was smooth as he spoke, but behind that charm was a man always ready to snap. As the investors took their seats, the atmosphere was heavy with formality. The little girl, trying to move quietly to the back where her mother stood, stumbled. Her book slipped from her arms, landing on the polished floor with a sound that echoed far louder than it should have. The room turned still. The investors glanced at her, then at the CEO. He stopped mid-sentence, his smile gone in an instant. His face darkened as he turned toward the child. Without thinking, he let his anger spill out. His voice rose, harsh and cutting. "Stupid kid." The words cracked through the air like thunder. The little girl froze, her eyes wide, her cheeks burning red. She didn't cry at first, she just stood there, as if the sound had stolen her breath. Then her eyes filled, and she quickly bent to pick up her book, clutching it tightly as if it could shield her. The maid's hands trembled, but she didn't dare move. She lowered her head, shame and fear pressing on her chest. Around the table, the investors exchanged glances. Some frowned, some whispered softly to one another in their own language. They were not only looking at a business leader, they were now seeing a man who had humiliated a child in front of them. The CEO straightened his tie and continued speaking as if nothing had happened. unaware that in that single careless outburst, something far bigger than pride had already shifted in the room. The insult still hung in the air long after the CEO pretended to brush it aside. He moved on with his presentation, speaking about profits, global reach, and unmatched growth. But the energy in the room had shifted. The investors no longer leaned forward with interest. Their eyes were not on the charts and numbers he proudly displayed. They were on the maid's daughter, who sat quietly at the back with her book pressed tight against her chest. One of the investors, an older man with silver hair, watched her closely. He had grandchildren of his own, and he could not shake the sting of those two words. To him, respect was worth more than gold. He leaned toward the others and spoke in a low tone. His words were calm, but his eyes carried disapproval. The younger investors nodded slowly, their faces hardening. They had been warned before about the CEO's pride, but now they had seen it for themselves. Meanwhile, the CEO carried on, confident that his empire spoke louder than anything else. He pointed at the graphs on the screen, highlighting how this deal would push both sides into new heights of success. His voice grew stronger, as though he was already celebrating the partnership. What he didn't notice was that every smile around the table had faded. The maid, still dusting in the corner, felt her heartache for her daughter. She had worked in silence for years, swallowing her dignity to provide for the little girl. Today, she wished she could stand tall and defend her child, but the risk was too great. She lowered her head again, though her eyes burned with quiet pain. The little girl tried to stay invisible, but she could feel the weight of the room. She traced her finger over the edge of her book, pretending to read, though the words swam before her eyes. Her mother's silence told her not to cry, so she held it in, across the table. The investors whispered more firmly now. They spoke about trust, about how a man reveals his true self in the smallest of moments. If he could humiliate a child so easily, what would stop him from disrespecting partners when the stakes grew high? The CEO finally paused, expecting applause or at least admiration. Instead, he met only stillness. The silence was not the silence of respect, it was the silence of judgment. The investors exchanged one final glance among themselves. A decision was already beginning to form, though the CEO had no idea. Behind the polished doors of the meeting room. The CEO thought everything was still under his control. He sipped his water, smiled to himself, and believed the silence of the investors meant they were impressed. But outside, when the investors asked for a short break, the truth was unfolding in hushed voices and serious faces. In a smaller lounge nearby, the group gathered without the CEO. Their tone was calm, but their decision carried the weight of billions. The silver-haired man spoke first, his voice steady. "We came here to test his vision, but we also came to test his character. What we saw today cannot be ignored." Another nodded, adding, "If he can humiliate a child in front of us, imagine how he will treat us when no one is watching." They were not talking about numbers anymore. They were talking about trust, honor, and values. For them, this was not only business, it was legacy. One investor leaned back, recalling stories of leaders who had destroyed empires because of arrogance. "We cannot build on a foundation of pride," he said. "The deal would make us rich, yes, but what would it cost our reputation?" Meanwhile, in the grand hall, the maid sat with her daughter during the break. She gently stroked the girl's hair, whispering, "Stay strong, my child." The little girl nodded, though her eyes still shimmered with the sting of the insult. She asked softly, "Mama, was I really stupid?" The maid's throat tightened, but she forced a tender smile and whispered, "No, my love. You are brighter than the stars." At that same moment, the CEO checked his watch impatiently. He was convinced the investors were finalizing terms, perhaps even fighting among themselves to offer him the better deal. His arrogance blinded him from the storm that had already formed against him. Back in the lounge, the final words were spoken. "If we shake his hand today, the world will know we stood beside a man who belittled a child." That is not the story we want tied to our name. There was no debate after that. One by one, they agreed. The decision was made. The $7.5 billion deal, the one that was supposed to be his greatest victory, was already lost, and yet, in the hall just a few steps away, The CEO still smiled confidently, unaware that the ground had already crumbled beneath his feet. The heavy doors opened again, and the investors returned to the long table. Their expressions were calm, almost too calm. The CEO straightened his tie, confident that the break had only delayed his triumph. He flashed a smile, leaned forward, and asked, "So, shall we finalize this historic deal?" His voice carried pride, as though the contract was already signed. But the room did not echo with agreement. The lead investor, the man with silver hair, set his folder on the table and folded his hands. His gaze was steady, his tone respectful but sharp. "We have considered your proposal," he said, "and though your numbers are strong, we cannot proceed." The CEO blinked, his smile faltering. "Excuse me," he asked, his voice cracking slightly. "You came all this way. You've seen the potential. Why would you walk away from billions?" The silver-haired man looked around the table before answering. His words were measured, but every syllable landed like a hammer. "We are not walking away from billions. We are walking away from a man who disrespects the innocent. If you cannot show kindness to a child standing quietly in her own mother's shadow, how can you be trusted to honor a partnership worth more than money?" The room went silent. The CEO's face burned red. He opened his mouth to argue, but no words came. He could see the investors rising, one by one, gathering their papers without regret. The deal was slipping away, not because of a weak proposal, but because of two careless words. At the back of the room, the maid held her daughter close. She felt the weight of what had just happened. For years, she had been invisible in this house, her child seen as nothing more than an extra shadow. But in this moment, her daughter's dignity had outweighed billions. The CEO tried to call out, tried to soften his tone, even forced a laugh. "It was just a child," he muttered. But that was the final mistake. The lead investor stopped at the door and turned back. "There's no such thing as just a child. Respect lost cannot be bought back." And with that, they walked out. The sound of the doors closing was louder than thunder. The mansion stood quiet again, but this silence was different. The CEO had built an empire of power and pride, yet in one careless instant, he had lost the greatest deal of his life. The maid squeezed her daughter's hand, whispering, "You see, my love, even the powerful bow to the truth."